Ukraine's top general is likely out, or not, maybe. It's confusing. There's a lot of mixed reporting on that front. But Ukraine did sink a Russian warship, and there's a lot of gaslighting going on about whether or not that singular event was very important. The European Union passed a significant Ukraine funding package. At the same time, the United States is just a complete mess on that front. Not clear if the U.S. in the near future will be sending anything additional to Ukraine. And a new poll asked Americans who they think is winning the war in Ukraine. 6 months ago, more people said Ukraine. Today, more people say Russia. So let's get into it. I'm recording this at 9:30 a.m. Central on Monday, February 5th, 2024. So some interesting news. I don't want to say this is necessarily the biggest news over the course of the past 7 to 10 days, but it's significant, is the conversation around the head of the Ukrainian military, General Zaluzhny, potentially being fired, being replaced, if you will. So this really started to spread across the internet like wildfire, people reporting this, but there was nothing official coming out. It was said that he was called into Zelensky's office, was offered different positions, he turned down. And then as this started to spread, the defense ministry put out a note saying, quote, "Dear journalists, an immediate answer to everyone is no, this is not true." Now, it looks like it's hard to tell how accurate that was. I think at the time that was accurate. Zaluzhny had not been fired. As of this recording, he still has not been fired or replaced or relieved. He's not resigned. None of those things. He's still in command. It looks like they're heading that direction, though. But you really have to read between the lines. The reason I say that is there's a new interview that Zelensky just did where in that interview he was kind of pressed on this. And he said, quote, "A reset, a new beginning is necessary. It's not about a single person, but about the direction of the country's leadership." So notice he's not squashing these rumors and saying it's not going to happen. He's saying, yeah, we're looking at kind of a broad change across the board. He said, "I'm thinking about this replacement, but you can't say here we replaced a single person. When we talk about this, I mean a replacement of a series of state leaders, not just a single sector like the military. If we want to win, we must push in the same direction, convinced of victory. We cannot be discouraged, let our arms fail. We must have the right positive energy." So a couple different things to keep in mind here. Zaluzhny is very, very popular in Ukraine. I believe I've seen some polls where Zaluzhny is more popular than Zelensky. So it would be challenging for Zelensky to just outright fire him. So that may be one of the reasons that it's grouped in with a lot of other state leaders at this point, just kind of a transition as a whole to kind of mitigate the impact of Zelensky firing one person who's very, very popular. The second part here is generals being relieved in a time of war is very, very normal. Just is. I think it's kind of underreported here in the West, but Russia has gone through a handful of overall commanders of the war. They had all sorts of different weird command structures at the start. So technically, those guys it's just been crazy. But I think it's kind of expected in a sense that we kind of expect that of Russia, whereas for some reason we don't expect that of Ukraine, even though this type of replacement at the top within the military formation is something that we do as well, both in current and previous conflicts. Generally, what that comes down to throughout history is when something does not go according to plan or there is a failure, somebody is held accountable. And if a colonel was fired, it wouldn't even make the news, right? It would look like everything is going just along the right track, no issues here, we're just going to keep on doing what we've been doing. Firing the head of a military, replacing the head of the military is a way to send a message as well. Whether you agree with that message or not, it is a way for Ukraine to say, looking back on the last year, the much anticipated counteroffensive or offensive, whichever way you want to call it, into the south and the eastern part of the country did not achieve the desired effects. Somebody has to be held accountable. And there can be a lot of finger pointing in a bunch of different directions, but by going to the very top, which again, this is kind of my read on what's happening here, going directly to Zaluzhny, it's Zelensky trying to say, as you know, the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian military, we are taking responsibility, holding the leadership accountable, the military leadership accountable. We are ready to make change to improve our situation going forward. Again, kind of an outsider's view, but it looks like, again, Zaluzhny is probably on his way out here in the near term. Then last week, we also got news, and Ukraine released a video that I'll play here, that they used unmanned surface vessels to attack and what looks like destroy a Russian warship. So this is a video of these USVs, waterborne drones, attacking the corvette Ivanets. Haven't heard anything as of this video official from Russia at all. Some Russian military bloggers did put out that the area had come under attack and the Ivanets had been hit. But I think that's the extent of Russia acknowledging this attack. which kind of lines up with major attacks that Ukraine has carried out against Russia in the past, especially when it comes to anything with the Navy. You think back to the Moskva right at the start of the war that was hit and sunk. I think still Russia has the official cause there listed as like a fire, just happened to start on board. I think that's still listed as the only thing that happened. Like no acknowledgement that Ukraine struck it with a missile. So not crazy that the Ivanets is still status unknown, if you will. No updates coming from Russia. Now, there were a couple conversations around this that I thought were worth bringing up. One was pointing to the cost of this ship and how cheap of a drone was able to destroy it. The numbers I saw thrown out were between $60 and $70 million for this one ship, which sounds about right. Naval vessels are huge around the world. So the argument there is look at this cheap drone. These cheap, relatively cheap USVs are able to destroy a $70 million vessel. That in this case, 100%, Ukraine got the better of that deal, right? Even though these USVs are a lot more expensive than the FPV style drones being used against tanks or armored personnel carriers, they're nowhere near $70 million, right? But this price differential, this cost differential has been a conversation from the very get-go. And one of the major challenges where Ukraine is in my opinion, on the wrong side of that has to do with air and missile defense. So we've seen a lot of drones, missiles, and rockets shot down with expensive surface-to-air systems. That cost differential is often brought up. Look how expensive it is to use a man-pad against a Shahed-style drone. We saw a lot of that. This is Ukraine coming out on the positive side of that transaction, but it's more and more, especially as drones become a more of a piece of everyday warfare, of conventional warfare. We're seeing them in the air and at sea. This cost differential question is going to continue to be a major conversation. The other side of this that I saw was a little bit of gaslighting, I think. People talking about how this isn't important. It doesn't matter. This ship wasn't doing anything important. Who cares? It's just $70 million. It's actually a victory for Russia. I think I heard one person say, look, anytime a naval vessel is sunk by any country anywhere around the world, it's a big deal. You can't just write that off and say it doesn't matter. I don't know the last time throughout history that a major military vessel was sunk in a time of war and the other country just said, well, it doesn't actually matter. In fact, that's a win for us. So to be clear, this isn't something that's going to end the war. It may not even change the outcome of the war, but to look at the sinking of a $70 million vessel and say, actually, that's a win for us, come on. You guys are smart. Look right past this. Clearly, this was a successful operation for Ukraine. Now, there is news coming out that Ukraine has potentially already received the ground-launched small-diameter bomb. This was interesting how the U.S. put it out. They announced it. They've been talking about this for months now. We'll talk about what it is here in a second. But they put out an announcement saying the shipments should start. In fact, they might already be there, which is, we get these all over the place. Sometimes the U.S. and different countries react or treat this differently, but sometimes the United States has said, like, yes, we are going to send this munition at some point in the future, and they just leave it at that. Other times, they don't really even talk about sending the munition, and the next thing we know, it's used in Ukraine. So it's kind of all across the board. So a look at what these ground-launched small-diameter bombs are. What they did here is they kind of merged two different types of weapon systems together, which overall makes for a pretty inexpensive platform, if you will. So the ground-launched small-diameter bomb takes the GBU-39 small-diameter bomb, which is already a thing. We already have that in production, and it attaches it to a Mike 26 rocket. That Mike 26 rocket was the booster portion of the cluster munitions that we used fired out of MLRS or HIMARS. So we're not using those cluster munitions anymore from those types of weapon systems. So what they were able to do was pull off that rocket, attach it to this bomb, add some wings, and you've got a whole new weapon system. So it sounds like there's some additional platforms that could launch these. I'm not sure if those have been sent over to Ukraine or if they have that capability yet. They can definitely be fired out of the HIMARS or MLRS platform, which of course Ukraine has plenty of at this point, or a handful of at this point, I should say. The munition here is GPS guided and is supposedly able to strike targets as far as 150 kilometers away. So that is a pretty significant and accurately, right? Accurately 150 kilometers is crazy. We just get so jaded by that, I think, at times. We're so used to precision strike munitions. Being able to hit something, like to put a munition, a small diameter bomb, into a garage from 150 kilometers away is wild. Just take a moment and recognize that. So overall, one of the big benefits here is the cost. again, going back to the cost conversation, right now what I'm seeing is and this is all the public information, it's very vague, so take it with a grain of salt. It sounds like these ground-launched small diameter bombs are coming out at around $40,000 per unit, which is more than 10 times cheaper than the standard Mike 3-1 rocket that is traditionally fired out of the HIMARS or MLRS. Then turning to the funding question, which I've said before, I think is the single most important aspect when it comes to understanding where this war is going in the future. So some news over the last week or so here, the European Union approved a $55 billion package for Ukraine, which locks in EU funding for Ukraine for 4 years. That's significant. That's a big deal. So French President Emmanuel Macron put out a statement saying, quote, "The message is clear. Russia can't count on any fatigue from the Europeans in their support for Ukraine." Now, on the other side, the United States, it's just a complete mess still. So originally, President Biden had put forward a $61 billion aid package that was held up in Congress. There were thoughts that it might pass by the end of the year, and here we are in February, and it still hasn't moved forward. Yesterday, House Speaker Mike Johnson said that he was going to push forward legislation giving $17.6 billion in military assistance for Israel with no funding offsets and no additional aid for Ukraine. So to take it back here a little ways, there was a time where our political leaders said that we are going to bundle Ukraine aid, Israel aid, and border funding, border security. That kind of just fell apart. That's not really the thing they're going with anymore. So for anybody who's not in the United States trying to keep up with U.S. domestic politics, I'm sorry, it's confusing, doesn't always make sense. It's confusing for us here too. So right now, again, the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, said they're pushing forward in the House military assistance for Israel. Nothing about Ukraine in that package. The Senate yesterday unveiled a $118 billion bipartisan deal that they say would boost border security and provide wartime aid for Israel and Ukraine. So the Senate deal that they're putting forward, again, we've got the House and we've got the Senate. The Senate deal would provide $60 billion in aid to Ukraine, $14.1 billion to Israel, $2.4 billion for security in the Red Sea, and $4.8 billion to support partners in Asia where tensions have spiked recently between China and Taiwan. I have no idea the direction this is going. One thought that comes to mind is for the longest time, the idea that we would not be providing any sort of military or financial support to Ukraine was hard to think about. It's hard to fathom. We were doing so much. We've kind of crossed that threshold now to where now we are not. I think there's still some trickling in from other programs, but in terms of these major funding packages, they came to a halt. There's been a lot of statements out of the U.S. recently that like certain things aren't getting done that need to get done for Ukraine. I don't know which direction that goes. I think there's an argument to say that we're going to push this forward, and before long, a full package will be passed and more aid will be forthcoming. I think there's also an argument there that people might say, wait a minute, I thought Ukraine would fail if we didn't provide in this funding. We haven't provided it for a few months. They're still there, which isn't really a great read of the situation. Of course, the military and economic aid is not a matter of how Ukraine fights today, but what they're able to do in the weeks, months, and years going forward. But either way, as of today, as of this recording, no clear end in sight in terms of U.S. future military aid to Ukraine. Then there was an interesting poll that came out last week showing that more American citizens today believe that Russia is winning the war than Ukraine. 6 months ago, it was the opposite. 6 months ago in August, more Americans believed that Ukraine was winning this war. So let's dive into this real quick. Two different polls. The one from August talked to 1,500 U.S. adult citizens. Then the one from the end of January, just last week, talked to 1,686 U.S. adult citizens, so roughly the same sample size. They said, who is currently winning the war? Back in August, 21% said Ukraine was winning, compared with 15% for Russia, and then 41% for neither. Today, that's essentially swapped. Today, 21% says that Russia is winning, and 18% says Ukraine, and then 37% for neither. They also asked the question, who do you think will be the eventual winner of this conflict? So not just who's winning right now, but who will win this in the long term. That's also changed a little bit. Back in August, 30% said Ukraine would be the eventual winner, compared to 21% for Russia and 14% equally likely. That has now changed to 28% for Russia, 24% for Ukraine, and 15% equally likely. So I thought that was interesting. The last 6 months has changed the perception of Americans. Just your average American walking down the street, ask them a poll question. 6 months ago, more people said that Ukraine was winning and would win. Today, and it's not huge margins. If these numbers, if it was still Ukraine leading these polls, but they narrowed a little bit, I'm not even sure that's much of a conversation. But the fact that they swapped, I thought was interesting. Again, relatively small numbers, relatively small sample size of these polls. It's kind of the normal size that YouGov economist goes with. But I did think that was notable. So anyways, I think it's interesting at times to not just talk through some of these poll numbers, but to show how they've changed over time. I would imagine this 6-month swing here has to do with the culmination of Ukraine's counteroffensive and people recognizing at this point that they were not able to achieve kind of the maximalist aims of what were kind of presented as possibilities there. But anyways, again, thought it was a poll worth mentioning. That's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out my Substack. Link is in the description below. We started to bring some more people on board, experts, analysts, researchers, authors, guys putting together really well-written pieces on topics that are complementary to what I'm talking about in these videos, and they're free. I think they'll be pretty good value. So if interested, check those out. Link is in the description below. But thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.